Hello and welcome to Dig School, cross-curricular learning themed around archaeology. This session is X-ray vision, when we'll be looking how archaeologists see below the surface without disturbing the ground. Key questions will be: how can archaeologists see beneath the surface? What does this tell us about change over time? And why does this matter? So a clue lies in the headlines that we occasionally see on the television and on the internet and in the papers about heat waves revealing ancient monuments. So how does this happen? Well, here's an example. So in this imaginary site, there's an enclosed Iron Age settlement has been built. It's got a roundhouse in the middle, a few little buildings around it, a bank to protect it, and a ditch on the outside, which is where the material to build the bank has come from, palisade on top. As time passes, the Iron Age roundhouse goes out of use. In the Roman period, somebody new is owning that site, and they build themselves a fashionable new rectangular Roman house. They have a garden and a few garden walls. The banks and ditches of the Iron Age roundhouse are still there, but the roundhouse itself has gone. Over time, after the end of the Roman period, this site ceased to be inhabited at all. All the traces of the buildings disappeared from sight. The bank and ditch of the original roundhouse are large, durable features, so they last for quite a while. But over the centuries, ploughing by medieval farmers through the centuries, right up into the modern day, gradually eroded away that bank and ditch, so that in due course there's no humps and bumps visible at all on the surface. But those buried features, the traces of the ditches that were dug to build the earthen bank and ditch, and the drip gully around that circular roundhouse, and the footings of the stone wall of that rectangular Roman building are still there below the surface, and they affect how the crop grows, leaving the marks that you can see in the image here, like the sort of ghosts of those past structures. And if this site should then come to be excavated, the topsoil will be taken off and those features will gradually be revealed. Some of them, the roundhouse and the buildings and the big circular bank and ditch, have been visible as crop marks in that growing crop. Other ones, the slighter features, the post holes of that fence that the Roman villa owner built, only become visible during excavation. So why does this happen? Well, we've seen how these stone walls or these banks and ditches or these holes in the ground where posts have been are constructed, and they affect the soil beneath the surface and even the sort of subsoil below the sort of everyday soil that's turned over a lot. After the site goes out of use, the ditch gradually silts up. The wall, if it's not maintained, will gradually crumble away. People will probably take the stone away to use somewhere else. Stone's a useful building material. The timber posts will rot away, though the holes that they were put into in the ground will survive. Over time, the ditch fills up completely, the bank becomes eroded away, whether through ploughing or just through the fact that over the years it's not being maintained. The soil that built it up gradually drifts down to the bottom. And eventually there may be no trace above ground and another layer of soil builds up at the top. But those buried features affect how anything growing on that land will do. So you can see in this diagram, we can see that where there's a deeper depth of soil, so that's where there's been a ditch cut, for example, or that drip gully from the Iron Age roundhouse, where you've got a greater depth of soil, where soil has drifted into these cut features as they filled up, That provides more moisture and more nutrients for the roots of anything that's growing there. So any crops or any plants that are growing there are likely to grow lusher and stronger. On the other hand, where there's a wall buried, that's giving you a thinner layer of soil, and plants don't grow well in stone or brick walls. So there, any plants will grow less well. They'll be thinner and less well nourished. So you'll often get a sort of where there's been a ditch or a cut feature, the crops will grow taller. Where there's been a wall, the crops will grow less tall, the sort of opposite of what was originally been the case, where the ditch would have been cut into the ground, that now sticks up out of the crop, where the wall that would have stuck up out of the ground is now lower in the crop. So we can see this sort of diagram here, and this is what it looks like when you start to look across the surface of the crop. So here we can see there's the remains of a ditch around a burial mound causing this crop mark. So the ditch that was dug around the edge of the burial mound, it's got a greater depth of soil, therefore the crop there is darker, it's growing thicker and it's growing more lush. Where there was another linear ditch, we can see that that's a even bigger feature, so that the grass there or the crop there is really growing higher. But on the right hand side you can see a pale area, shows where there was a previous wall. There the crop is thinner, if it's hot or dry it'll die off sooner, or if it's a cereal crop it'll ripen sooner. And we can see in the sort of section, the captions at the bottom of the page explain this, showing how it's the deep soil is causing the plants to grow, and it's the thinner soil which is starving them of the moisture and nutrients that they need to grow well. Now we can see here the sort of effect this can have when we're looking from the air at archaeological remains. So here at the bottom of the page we can see there's an arable field, but it hasn't got a crop in it at the moment. You can see it's just brown bare soil. But you can see it's not all consistently the same colour. You can see lines and markings of darker colours, and that's showing where there are ditches or were ditches previously which are filled up with soil which is darker than the natural subsoil around them. At the top of the page, above the road, we can see where in the growing crop, which is green, we can also see features. They're not quite as clearly visible, but we can certainly see there are some straight lines and some rectangular right-angled turns in some of them. Looks like a slightly different sort of bit of settlement there, bit of archaeology there. Of course, we don't know what it is or what date it is because we haven't excavated it, but we can get an idea just by looking at the shape of the earthwork, the shape of the features. And these features that can then be traced off these photographs, corrected using computers to align them the right way, and then marked on maps, so that even if the conditions aren't right for them to show up in the soil again or be visible in a crop another time, we've got a permanent record of where those features were. And then we can look at them, we can compare them with examples that have been excavated and give them a likely date. So in these green features here are picking up all the features that are probably of early or middle Anglo-Saxon date, because similar features like that, where they have been excavated, have turned out to be Anglo-Saxon. So to summarise, soil marks then are visible in bare soil and they don't depend on any particular weather to become visible. Crop marks are caused by buried features affecting how crops grow, so they're most common between May and July when crops are growing and ripening. They can appear in any year, but they're most widespread and informative in hot, dry summers when the difference between the crops that have access to deep soil, where the roots can go down deep and get moisture from further down, the advantage they have over the bits of crop that are over walls, where there's no opportunity for the roots to go down and get moisture, therefore those crops will die off. That difference is much more marked in a hot, dry period of weather. Then there are parch marks. These are features that when droughts occur and cause grass to die off where the soil is thinnest. is exactly the same effect. Instead of being in a cultivated crop, that's in grassland or even on a lawn. So have a look at these two diagrams. You've got the soil marks on the left and the crop marks on the right. And just remind yourself by thinking, are those crop marks, are they from ditches cut down into the ground, or are they from walls that were built up and whose footings are still surviving underground? Okay, so you've had a minute to remind yourself, of course, that the dark green features are the cut features, the ones that have been cut down into the ground, and the lighter features are the buried walls or stony surfaces. So let's look at some real examples and give you a chance to put the knowledge you've now got about how these features formed to practice. So this is a site at a place called Knowlton in Dorset. There's a very marked prehistoric henge monument, a big circular monument with an external bank and an internal ditch. And in fact, this one is actually got a church in the middle of it. So have a look at this, and this is just the most recent image of Google Earth, and see what other features you can see there. Okay, so you've had a few minutes to have a look for other features. Now, what I'm going to show you now is an aerial photograph of exactly the same place, taken in a hot, dry summer. And that's what was visible there. Now, ignore the parallel lines sort of going right across the photograph because those are just where the tractor went up most recently, spraying fertilizer or herbicide or pesticide on the crops. So ignore those, ignore the big long parallel lines, but look at everything else. So write down all of the features that you can see on that bottom photograph, and then have another look at the one at the top and just see if you can maybe see a bit more in that now that you can see hints of what actually turns up when the conditions are right. When you're writing down what you can see, have a think as to whether what you're seeing are banks that have been built up or whether they're ditches that have been cut into the ground. Okay, so how did you get on? So there's quite a lot going on here. So there's what looks like a small burial mound, perhaps there, definitely a mound. You can see it's light. That's where the crop has died off because it's stony. There's not enough moisture. Another one there. There's another one just round the edge of this belt of trees. Can you see just on the bottom of that? You can see two parallel light lines with a darker line in between. Looks like there's a ditch been dug there, perhaps with a little bit of a bank either side of it where the spoil from the ditch has been thrown out. There's a very obvious feature there, a ditch, double ditch for the looks of it, around another circular feature, and perhaps that darker feature in the middle could even be where there's been a grave cut or a burial, or perhaps a large pit in the middle. Definitely looks like a cut feature there. Then we can see there's other features again, another small circular embanked feature there, another one at the top there, and then another huge one right up the top there. So you can see how much this technique shows us that is completely invisible. And often these crop marks are really only there for a very short period of time. As soon as the rest of the crop catches up and ripens as well, the whole crop's yellow, and there's none of those distinctions to be seen at all. And of course, as soon as it's harvested, it's all gone completely. Let's have another look at another one then. Can you see where the hill fort is? This big circular hill fort in the photograph on the left there. Give you a couple of minutes to have a quick look for that. Again, this is just from Google Earth, and this was taken again a couple of years ago when we had a very hot, dry period in May, June and July. It was very good for crop marks appearing. See, it's the same field, but it looks very, very different. And you can see very clearly there the outline of that circular hill fort there. And there's a dark circle, which is the ditch. On the inside of that, there's a lighter band, which is the bank that's been defending that hill fort. And perhaps right on the outside at the top of the circle that I've outlined in white, looks like there's another bank there, so that might be an additional defence that's also been made. Perhaps that's where the entrance is. It looks like there might have been an entranceway at that part of the hill fort there. Okay, so now you've got your eye in, here's another example. So what I'd like to do is have a good look at this and then write down the answers to the questions. So decide whether the features here are walls or ditches. You should be good at spotting that by now. Then draw a plan of all the features you can see. And you can see there are two different crops there. And then answer the questions. As a hint, to get an idea of scale, there's two white arrows there are pointing to the tractor tyre marks in the crop. Again, that's where they've been spraying pesticide or something, or fertilizer to help the crop grow. Those tyre tracks are about 2 meters apart, so that'll give you a bit of a feeling for scale. So I'll give you a few minutes to look as carefully as you can at that picture and answer those questions. So you've had a chance to have a look at that picture and answer the questions. So were the feature on this photo walls or ditches? Well, they're walls, aren't they? Because the crop is dying off, it's a lighter colour, it hasn't got enough moisture, so that tells us there are walls. I don't know what you draw in the way of the features you could see, but I think you've probably drawn a big rectangular square with a couple of lines down it and a whole load of little square cells on the right-hand side there. So what do you think the walls were made of? Well, again, you know that it's stuff like brick and stone is what those roots are going to find it hard to grow in, so they're likely to be made of brick or stone rather than something like timber. How many small rooms were there? Well, you just count them up. There's 8 or 9 if you count the centre room. Now that centre one seems to have a bit of a double line round it. So it's just possible that's actually quite an ornate entranceway, and that's where somebody would have come into this complex and then been able to walk to the left or the right and then go into any of those rooms. And there's perhaps a garden or another wall, or perhaps a sort of colonnaded way that's defined by that line that goes down the middle of the feature. And if you look very carefully, you can see that actually that feature is carrying it on into the yellower coloured crop as well. This is actually one of the central administrative buildings, the Principia, in a Roman legionary fortress at Carpal in Scotland. Okay, so here's another one. Rather different sort of site. This is a gatehouse of a house built in around about the 1550s. All of the buildings, apart from the gatehouse, have been demolished just after the Second World War. So again, have a look at this and take as long as you want looking at it and answer the questions. So you've had a chance to have a think about this, to look at all of those features and answer the questions. So the first question was then, are they crop marks or parch marks? And there was just that hint there, what would the sheep be eating? Now, if you were trying to grow a crop like wheat or barley to harvest, you wouldn't want sheep in there, but you can see those sheep just by on the right-hand side of the tree, by that gatehouse, the standing building there, those little white dots of the sheep. So that gives you a pretty good clue that it's grass there, it's pasture that the sheep are eating, not an arable crop. It also just looks like grass, and there's no sign of any of those tractor marks as well, which are so typical of a cultivated field. So were the features walls or were they cut into the ground? Well, again, they're white, they're showing up lighter than the surrounding area, so that suggests they're walls made of stone or brick. What shape were the buildings? Well, they're generally pretty square, aren't they? You can see the layout of them, both sides of that driveway that's leading up through the gatehouse. So I wonder what you put on the plan that you drew of all of the features that you could see. Now, we don't have any recent photographs of what this complex looked like before it was demolished, but we do have an engraving. This engraving was drawn by someone standing roughly where the black X is marked. So you can see the driveway leading up to the gatehouse. The person is standing on the right-hand side of the gate of the driveway there. And you can see there are hints of a building to the artist's right. You can see a crenellated building with big windows. That looks like a large church or a chapel, which is entirely what one might expect, just inside the gatehouse of this large 16th century sort of Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth period complex. You'd come through the gatehouse into a large courtyard with lots of buildings around it. And immediately as you come in sort of the prime area, there's a church and you can, or chapel, and you can just see that there's perhaps a curved end just above the X there, suggesting the building's got a little curved at one end. On the other side of the drive, you can see a complex of buildings, and again, one of those is just showing up on that engraving on the left-hand side of the plan there. But we can't see anything else behind that. In fact, the only evidence we have for that is from these parch marks, which only show up in years when it's been hot and dry, enough to make the grass die off. Okay, here's another one to have a go at. So again, have a good look at this, work your way through the questions in your workbook. So now you've had a chance to answer those questions. Which of the features on the photograph do you think were stony walls, banks or stony surfaces? And which features were ditches or pits cut into the ground? Well, I'm sure you've got hang with the fact now that actually here the dark green features are the ditches or the pits cut into the ground. And you can see you've got some big wide ditches that are forming a rectangular shape with sort of curved corners. That's absolutely typical of a Roman fort. And as you can see at the bottom, this is a Roman legionary fort in North Yorkshire. You can see there's a smaller outer ditch as well, and a hint perhaps that there's a bit of a bank in between them, the lighter band in between them. You can see there's a sort of a double line of dark green ditches inside the fortress. That might even mean there was an earlier, smaller fortress, and that then a larger legionary fort was built later on. In terms of which features were sort of walls or banks or stony surfaces, it's the ones that are showing up as light colours. So I hope you enjoyed drawing a plan of everything you could see. I asked you where was the entrance to the fort. I'm sure you got that the obvious place for that was there because it's the only place where there's a break in that big ditch. It's the only area you could possibly have got across and into the fort. What do you think the light colour feature leading from the entrance was? Well, it looks very much like there's been a paved road or a metalled road, a hard, solid road surface leading right through the middle of the fortress here. And then where were all the stone buildings? The bright green features rather grab your attention, but those are the cut features. But actually there's a whole cluster, both sides of that central road, a whole cluster of rectangular light-coloured features there, which look like the remains of stone footings of stone buildings. Okay, another one for you to have a go at here. So again, there are the questions. I'll give you a few minutes to work through those. Okay, so you've had some time to work through those questions. Again, that first question, are they walls or are they cut into the ground? Well, here they're very much cut into the ground. All the features you can see are dark green, showing that depth of soil, giving that crop more in the way of nutrients. The plan, I imagine you drew a plan of a whole series of square enclosures. It's another Roman site, but it's very different to that Roman fortress that we've just looked at. It's a farm site, and there would have been tens of thousands of these in Britain in the Roman period, intensively farming the landscape. You can see field boundaries, you can see entrances to the fields, and you can see trackways that are leading, enabling people to walk from one field to another without crossing the fields in between. I asked you, why might a farmhouse not show up as a crop mark? We can't see an obvious site for a farmhouse in the same way that we could see it in the legionary fortress, or indeed in that example I showed you right at the beginning. And of course the answer to that may well be, well, perhaps it was built of timber and it didn't leave much trace, it didn't cut into the surface at all. It's possible that it was in a different field a bit further away. We'd sort of expect to have a farmhouse quite close to here though. So it may simply be that it didn't leave any trace in the ground. And I asked you, can you see a smaller, earlier keyhole-shaped enclosure? Because it's very easy to look at these photos and think, well, we can see them all at the same time, therefore all of the evidence must be of the same date. But actually we can see here it isn't. Here's this earlier feature. We can see it sort of is broadly keyhole-shaped. It looks like there's an entrance on the bottom left-hand side. And it's obviously earlier than the fields because the fields are cutting straight across it. Okay, and here's a last example for you to have a really good go at. Now, in looking at this, again, you've got a series of questions there. There's a lot going on in this photograph. But I have just pointed out the features to ignore, the ones on the far right-hand side, because they're just from the geology, from the natural processes that created the land surface before humans got to do anything with it. So those sort of irregular, very thin cracking lines are from the geology. And those sort of general, rather fuzzy dark green features, again, those are just undulations in the natural geology as well. So have a look at the rest of the features and see what you can find in the way of trackways, field boundaries, square residential compounds, ditches around circular burial mounds like we saw at Knowlton, even down to tiny little pits that are used for storage in the ground or for throwing away rubbish. And also think about whether you think they're all in use at the same time and why you think that, or think they weren't in use at all the same time. I'll give you a bit of time to look at that. So you've had plenty of time to look at that, and I'm not going to draw all that on the map because it just gets too busy really. But you can see, I think you've got a large trackway leading from the bottom left-hand side into a sort of big open area that's got a lot of tiny little dots that are probably storage and rubbish pits, which suggests people are living there. You can see a number of sort of roughly rectangular enclosures that look like compounds, residential compounds that people would have lived in. And you can see a whole series of those sort of cutting across each other, suggesting you've got different periods of activity. And then you've also got a load of circular ring ditches round those burial mounds, and it's unlikely that those are the same date as the residential compounds, because again, they're all just on top of each other. So we've got a complex multi-period landscape showing up here, only visible in those crops, just because it's been dry enough for the crop growth to be affected. Otherwise, none of this would show at all. The ground surface is completely level. So that's the end of part 1. Take a short break if you want to, and then we'll carry on with part 2. So for part 2, we're going to look at the very obvious problem is that in many parts of the world, and certainly in the UK, waiting for hot, dry weather to show up crop marks requires a lot of patience and a lot of luck. Just get a rainstorm at the wrong time, the crop rapidly catches up, or if the dry weather's just a bit too late when the crop's already started to ripen, it won't work. So archaeologists have developed other geophysical techniques to try and scan beneath the surface, either without having to commit to excavation at all, or to help them target exactly where to excavate. So there are two main techniques that are very commonly used. One is resistivity. Now this basically uses exactly the same evidence really that the crop marks do, which is that archaeological features affect the amount of moisture in the soil. We've already seen that. The resistivity uses an electrical current which it passes through the ground and measures the amount of resistance that that current encounters. Now, water conducts electricity very well. That's why you're not allowed electrical fittings in bathrooms. So wetter deposits like ditches and pits and graves and so on produce lower readings on a resistance meter. The electrical current meets very little resistance. It can whiz through a wetter ground very easily. Stone and brick don't conduct electricity really very much at all, and they're drier as well, so there's no water to help conduct the electricity. So buried walls and banks and paved roads and whatever produce higher resistance readings. So an archaeological resistance survey simply involves putting probes attached to a resistivity meter into the ground, and the resistivity meter records the resistance as the current goes round. You then take the probes out of the ground, move forward a step and do it again, as you can see a former colleague of mine doing in the picture at the bottom of the page here. And again, and again, and again. Resistivity is brilliant for detecting archaeological features, but it is quite slow because it takes several seconds for each reading to be registered, and then you've got to pull the probes out of the ground, move forward and put them back in again. So the second technique that's often used is magnetometry. Now, this measures differences in the magnetism of the ground. And the reason this works for archaeology is because things that have been heated give off a different magnetic reading to the ground around them. So magnetometry is good for detecting metal because that's been heated, bricks, kilns, hearths, fireplaces, anything like that. But it can also pick up features with lots of organic material. And that's often what the fills of ditches and pits have in them. They have a lot of organic material because it's soil that's got died off grass or other rubbish from a settlement or whatever that ends up in the bottom of those features. So magnetometry can pick up features like ditches and pits. It's much quicker than resistivity, but it doesn't usually give such good archaeological detail unless you're particularly looking for something like a kiln or a hearth. So a commonly used strategy is to do a rapid magnetometry survey, which you can do as quickly as you can run across a surface. In fact, if you get your magnetometer rigged up right, you can even sort of tow it behind a mechanical vehicle. So you can quickly do a magnetometry survey of a big area, get an idea of which area is going to be of interest, then do a detailed resistivity survey, and then work out either exactly what you think the site is or where you want to put your trenches for excavation. So here's a range of magnetometry plots. They're 4 sets of pairs. For each there's one which is the graph printout, which shows the spike in the magnetic readings where it hits a feature that's very different to the area around it. And each of those is paired up with the same data, which is plotted in a different way on a grayscale, which shows archaeological features, those with that are likely to have been heated, or those sort of cut features as a much darker colour on the grayscale diagram. So can you match up the pairs? And can you also work out what any of the features are? You've seen a few different sorts of archaeological feature when we were looking at crop marks and parch marks. So you've got a little bit of background knowledge. Have a think and see if any of those look familiar at all as you're looking at these pairs here. Okay, so you've had a few minutes to match up the pairs. I expect you found it quite easy to do that. So A matches up with G. And in fact, those are both the remains of medieval plough ridges. So just like in the modern day, we have tractors leave those sort of traces where the tractors have been in the soil. In the medieval period, they used to deliberately cultivate into their ground into ridges, and that's the sort of feature that shows that we've had a medieval field system. B, as you can see, matches up with H. It's a large ditch extending right diagonally across the page there. C matches up with E, and again, it's very similar to the features you saw before, a large sort of ditched enclosure, a squarish ditched enclosure with some other features extending off that. So a settlement of some sort of date. Difficult to tell from that whether it's likely to be Roman or medieval in date. Generally, rectangular features tend to either be Roman or medieval or later. And then C, of course, matches up with F. And perhaps you did get that because that again is ring ditches, those ditches that you get around burial mounds that are often the only trace of that burial mound that survives once they've been ploughed out. So here we've got a couple of big magnetometry surveys. So for this one, can you pick out, have a look at it and pick out which features you think are likely to be of archaeological interest from the magnetometry survey? Which areas would you suggest the resistivity survey went and did a detailed record of? Have you any idea what they might be? So how did you get on with that? Well, it can be a bit difficult to look at these sometime, and it's a complicated, very, very skilled process to look at this data and really understand what it's telling you. But in this case, the people who did that analysis were able to identify the red areas are the areas with high archaeological potential, and I think perhaps you might well have picked up that rectangular feature with the line across the middle of it, so it looks a bit like a domino. Again, looks like an enclosure, a couple of rectangular enclosures, so again, probably Roman or medieval. There's a few other features that have been picked out by the archaeologists doing the analysis here in brown. They're agricultural features, so field boundaries and field remains. And then the rest of the features have been picked out in green as of probably natural origin. So again, it's a bit like those bits I told you to ignore, where it's just to do with the underlying geology, nothing to do with anything that humans have been doing at all. So we've got a bit of a different sort of plot here. So again, can you pick out which of these features are likely to be of archaeological interest? And do you have any idea what they might be? So I wonder if you remembered what these were. You've seen those long ridges before in those when you were matching your pairs up, in fact. So well done if you spotted that those are medieval field remains. And in fact, the very slightly curved shape is absolutely classic, sort of reversed S-shaped curve is actually classic of medieval ridge and furrow field systems. And you can see in the analysis, these have been picked out in brown. What's quite interesting as well is you can see at the top of the page, while they've still been picked out as brown as probably just agricultural, it's a lot more speckled up there. And that's often referred to by geophysicists just as sort of noise. It suggests there's a lot of something going on there, but they're not quite sure what. And actually this is the area where if there was a settlement nearby, we might well expect that to be coming in, where you've got the field systems and then the backs of the tofts and crofts, which where the medieval peasants would have been living, might well have just backed onto those fields. So I'd have been really interested to see what the magnetic survey showed in the next field on above that page. So finally, we'll just look at a few examples of geophysical surveys to see if you can match up what you think they might have been. So we've got 5 different types of site here, either as photographs, aerial photographs, or reconstruction drawings. Now the geophysical surveys you'll see aren't of exactly the same site, but they're the same sort of site. So have a quick minute to see if you can work out what you think each of these sites are, A, B, C, D and E. Okay, so to go through those, A is an Iron Age settlement with those circular roundhouses that you can see, and in fact you've got a ditch on the outside of it. You can just see people walking across a bridge there, and a palisade on top of the bank that's going into the into the hill fort. You can only see a bit of it, and then you can see the roundhouses of the people living inside the hill fort there. B is a medieval village. You can see the houses along the street there, and then the tofts, the sort of enclosed yards or paddocks just behind them, and then behind those again, the remains of the fields, just like we saw in that earlier magnetometry survey plot. C is a Roman villa, large rectangular building. Again, we saw some of those earlier on. In this case, there's a whole suite of rooms in a series of wings, an elegantly laid out garden. There's about 2 sort of courtyard garden areas. D is a medieval moated site, the sort of high status residence 1,000 years or more after the Roman period. And then E is one of these burial mound cemeteries. This is an example of one that hasn't been ploughed out, but you can see where you get those ditches around the burial mounds, and while you can plough away the burial mound, however much the ditch gets filled in, it will still often leave the soil different and likely to be able to create crop marks or soil marks because it's got a more organic, rich, moisture retaining content to it. So you've got the 5 types of sites. I'm just going to run through these pictures of the geophysical surveys, stop on each one, and you can spend as long as you like trying to work out which one is which. So how did you get on trying to match those up then? So I'll just skip back to the beginning here. So that was the first one. I expect you got that. It's those ring ditches again. I think you're getting quite good at recognising those now. You can see that showing up very clearly. There's one at the top of the page, is a sort of double ring ditch. There's clearly been one mound and then another one added onto it, and then a ditch sort of dug around both of them to join them together. And there's a couple of single ones and a couple of other sort of slight double ones on the left and right of the page as well. This is the Iron Age hill fort. You can see that there's the circles of the roundhouses at the bottom of the page, and you can see there's some big curving dark lines going around the outer edge of the feature there, of the plot there, and another feature coming in sort of about halfway into the middle as well, and then a big trackway going right across the middle of the feature there as well. So that's quite a tricky one to work out there, so well done if you got that right. Here you've got a feature with lots of rectangular buildings laid out at right angles. Looks very, very like that Roman villa we saw there. So well done if you got that right. And you can see you've even got that same arrangement with one courtyard and then another set of walls running off down beyond that to create a sort of second courtyard and a whole series of rooms within those wings of the villa. And you can actually see where you've got corridors around the edge and then the rooms just inside that. So you could do a really quite detailed reconstruction drawing of this building really without excavating it at all. Here's a slightly more difficult feature to see, but of course looking at the 5 sites you've only got a couple left now, and this is a medieval moated site where you've got the magnetic difference is very strong at the corner of that moated site where it comes round, and you can just see hints as well of parallel lines which look to be where the moated site has been overlain by ridge and furrow field systems. And then finally, the last one, well, you've only got one option left, which was the medieval village, and that is what this is. And you can see here, you've got the sort of central street, which is, there's no data in the middle there, but you can see either side of it, you've got rectangular plots of those tofts and crofts laid out either side of the big central street there. So I hope that's given you an idea of how archaeologists can see beneath the surface and see how this tells us about change over time. It tells us how very different areas of the countryside, which are simply just fields now, how differently they've been used in the past. Even if they've been fields in the past, those fields have been very differently laid out. And in some cases, they've been used for very, very different purposes indeed, for settlements where people are living, even up to really opulent, elaborate villas, Roman villas, or perhaps for cemeteries for burial remains. And I hope you've got a feeling of why this matters. It's amazing that we're able to record this. These features, particularly if we're seeing as crop marks, are often visible only for a very short period of time. And if you're studying this in June when this dig school is released, this is absolutely the perfect time of year for crop marks, particularly if it's been quite hot and dry. It gives us a chance to see beneath the surface, sometimes just for a blink of an eye, sometimes for longer, and of course with a geophysical survey we can find out what's beneath the surface much more frequently, and that helps us understand much better what the history of this country, or indeed any country, has been like. With Google Earth you can go away now and have a look at any place you want to and just see if there's any traces of any crop marks or any parch marks or any other archaeological features that might tell you something about what was going on there. So I hope you enjoyed this dig school, and I hope to see you again at another dig school in the future. Thank you.